Okay, guys, let's get started with the lecture today. So today we will continue talking a little bit about false enforcement of norms, but also about, identity of norm informers and so on. But before we start with the substantive content of this lecture, let me remind you that next week there are no lectures. So next week it's reading week here, so no lectures in sociology. It might be different for other lectures that you have in other schools, but sociology, there are no lectures. It doesn't mean that you don't have nothing to do, right? In fact, you have, it's great to have this breather in the middle of the term, to be honest, to catch up on things a little bit, and it's dedicated for reading. As you are aware, there's a lot of reading to be done in this module. I'm aware of that. I'm asking you to read 2 papers every week. But actually be happy. I had to go through modules in my master's degree where I had to read 200 pages per week. Yeah, I was just bam. I'll read 3 books. I know there's very detailed stuff about these 3 books. That was a nightmare. So in that regard, I think it's sort of still manageable. Hopefully these are all interesting readings for you, but catch up on it. Not only is this interesting, but also this is relevant for the exam at the end of the day, right? So you do need to know the required readings. But on the top of that, I have a couple of fun readings that I put on the syllabus. I cannot upload them in total because they are complete books. I can upload chapters. I don't know. Otherwise, I get in a legal mess if I upload a whole book. But I can highly recommend these 3 readings. They are 3 of my all-time favorites. If you like the kind of stuff that we do here, first one, Thomas Schelling, Nobel Prize winner, Micromotives, Macro Behavior. Then the other one, The Wisdom of the Crowds. It's really just, more from the chapter that you guys had to read already. And there's a recent book by Damon Sentler about how behavior spreads, the science of complex contagions. That's quite exciting as well. Yeah. So, if you like these kind of things, feel free to read more on that. But focus on the required readings, that's required at the end of the day. Okay, and there's another thing, got so many things happening. I don't know got so many things happening in my life, I constantly have to go to this meeting and that one, but you have the same thing. You have to go to this lecture, to that one, and you have that seminar, and here you have an assignment, there you have an assignment. Well, actually, here now you have an assignment too. So it is online since last Tuesday, as I had outlined. This is basically the assignment. It's a 3-page assignment, right? So read it carefully. There are kind of 3 main assignments in it. You have to do all 3 of them. There are subpoints of that, and please address each of the subpoints, because that's the easiest way where you can lose points if you don't do what is in there. At the end of the day, I think there are 12 subpoints. So actually, I have 12 columns for each one of you, to really see, how many points you score on this, how many points you score on this, and so on. So do it all. Not doing, or only doing parts of the assignment is the easiest way how you can lose points on this. So please don't, because I want to give you points. It makes up 20% of your overall grade. We're upping the game a little bit. The take-home test was 10%. This is going to be 20%. Okay, it's due on the 6th of November, 3 p.m., and it's Blackboard submission only. So don't send anything to me by email. Don't put anything in my submission box. Actually, I recently discovered when I opened the submission box, which I open once a year, there was stuff lying in there. So don't do that. Unless you want me to find it in 2 years or something like that. I just don't do paper anymore. It's just, it's a mess and it gets in trouble. So do it online. Okay, do you guys have any questions about the assignments? Yeah? No questions? This is your chance. Fire away. Okay, I take it as a sign that it's actually clear. I hope to be clear. I hope that the instructions are clear. So complete the assignment in time. It's hard to judge, I ask you to write 1,500 to 2,000 words on that, which is sort of what we recommend for 20% of a grade kind of assignment. Depends on how long it takes for you. Don't underestimate it, but don't freak out about it either. It's not like the world. This is all straightforward stuff that you should be able to do. You sit down, spend an afternoon on it, you get it done, right? But obviously also, maybe as a piece of advice, I can give that you guys here now as well. Also kind of make an effort in writing this nicely. Yeah? This also feeds into the evaluation. I don't just, I don't know, give you points for, okay, I don't know, did you address what is asked from you, but also like, how did you do it? Yeah. Okay, so much about the assignment, unless there are any other questions about it. Great. Okay, so this is what I brought with me for today, for the last lecture before the break. I want to follow up on false enforcement. We kind of came to the point where I gave a definition about what false enforcement is, but then, I actually want to delve into the reading that you guys had to do for last Tuesday on how actually false enforcement occurs, or does it occur? Is it just something that we make up, or actually can you show this in a study? And there's a very cool study by Rob Willer and others on that. And then I want to touch a little bit on the stability of unpopular norms. Why don't they just go away? And then we are sort of like in this emperor's dilemma, and another cool study by Damon Centola that shows that unpopular norms can be remarkably stable once we have false enforcement, where people enforce something that they don't really believe. And lastly, I want to talk about the identity of enforcers, and in that context, I will touch on the reading that you guys had to do for today. Okay. But let's roll back a little bit. So we asked the question, why do we have unpopular norms? Norms that don't seem to make sense. Why are they there? And one suggestion was because they are enforced. Right? Somebody enforces that. Somebody tells you to do that, even though it doesn't make sense. But then you're going to argue, but why would people enforce something that is unpopular to begin with, and that they do not believe in themselves? Right? You could argue, well, maybe they enforce it because they were enforced like that, and actually that's exactly sort of like where the Centola paper is going. But now we're talking about people enforcing something that they don't really believe in themselves. So I enforce a certain rule. I enforce a certain rule, for example, that you don't curse in this lecture, while I don't really believe in it myself. Feel free, fire away, I do it all the time. But I would enforce it. I would apply disciplinary measures on it, even though privately I think, what the fuck? Yeah. Okay, so false enforcement. Let's recapture it a little bit. False enforcement is the public enforcement of a norm by people who privately oppose it. Yeah? I enforce it, I make you do something, even though I privately think it's bollocks. Yeah? And now, in relation to norms, I enforce you to behave in a certain way. I enforce you to do something, even though I think, what's the point? But I do it anyway. Okay, so why would people do that? Well, one suggestion is because of social pressure. Like other people, or you think that others kind of want you to behave in a certain way, and because of that, not only do you behave like that, but in order to show your sincerity to it, you enforce it too. And the example that I brought up the last time was the one of alcohol drinking of college undergraduates. There's examples in the United States, lots of studies on that, where students don't really want to drink lots of alcohol, but they think they have to in order to be cool, but then they realize that they don't want to look like the loser who just drinks because they want to look cool, so in order to avoid that, they make others drink too. That sort of makes them more sincere in this whole enterprise of showing that they don't just comply to it because of social pressure. You give the impression that it was like your idea to begin with. Nobody wants a guy who does it because other people told them that. So, and you're looking just desperate. Okay, so now the idea here is, can this social pressure not just lead to conformity, but can it also lead to the false enforcement of norms? Do people punish others for doing something they do not believe in themselves simply because their group seems to believe in it? Right? So now the idea is, hopefully you get this. It's not just that there's disbelief, you don't believe in something, and there's social pressure, which might lead to conformity, that you start saying what you don't really believe in it. But on the top of that, can this lead to false enforcement? Can this lead to the situation where you also punish others who say that they do not believe in it? Okay, and that's basically what this paper is about that you guys had to read for last Tuesday, it's a great exam question, false enforcement. Just putting it out there. False enforcement of unpopular norms by Rob Willer and others, who, by the way, does really cool work. So Rob Willer is one of my heroes, one of those guys that I admire for what they do. And Michael Macy, anyway. I know Michael quite well. He's a professor at Cornell, and actually I visited him when I was a student. I was staying with his lab for a while. He does really cool stuff in the whole area of complex systems, computational social science, and so on. Okay, so in this paper, Willer and others, they actually conduct a couple of studies. I'm going to focus on two now. And how cool is that? The first study is about drinking wine. And the second one is about reading a text. Actually, it's about a really crazy text that I made you guys read as well, which is the Transgressing the Boundaries norm by Alan Sokal. Right? But let's first get started with the study on evaluating wines. So what they did in this study, they brought in undergraduate sociology students, folks like you. Actually, they told them that they had been selected for their great aesthetic taste, right? Which is not true, but they just made it up so that students felt, they're kind of good in judging things, And they had them brought in a lab. What we mean by lab is often these kind of cubicles. Actually, now UCD has a lab like that as well. I think it's at the Geary Institute, Behavioral Economics. They use these kind of things a lot, where individuals are being brought in and, they're being separated from others. They look at the computer and then they basically, they're prompted with certain things and then you log how they react. Right? Like, what do they do? How do they behave? And they have certain choices to make afterwards and so on. Right? So in this case, the students, they were actually given wine, but I'll come back to that in a second. They had to drink that wine. How nice is that? And then they were given questions about that wine while not actually seeing what the others answered on that. Right? But they were given the impression that others answered in a certain way. But that was just the first part of it. And these are the kind of experiments that people conduct a lot, but the real innovativeness comes into play at the next level. So basically what they did, so Willer and others, they told those students that they're conducting this very ancient, or this old Dutch wine tasting procedure, which doesn't exist. There's no old Dutch wine tasting procedure, right? And they said it's like this old tasting. It happened in the 1500s, 1600s. People did that in the Netherlands, and we want to do this now again. And it works in the way that you don't just evaluate those wines. You don't just tell us how good you find these wines, but afterwards you're also going to evaluate the other people in the room who evaluated the wine. Right? So not just that we sit there and we all say what we thought about the wine, but afterwards we say, well, I think your comment wasn't that great, right? While your comment was really intelligent in a way. So that's the idea, right? That afterwards there was this second round of evaluating each other. Okay, and that's what happened in the second round, right? So they kind of evaluated each other. So 52 students, they participate in this, groups of 6 of aesthetic taste in different domains, and that's what they were told. While, in fact, each participant was sitting in a cubicle, and they were told they would interact with the other 5 participants in their group during the experiment, while, in fact, they did not. So some people, especially in economics, they would say, oh, this is dodgy design, but, social psychology, they are absolutely fine with these kind of things. So students were told they would interact with the other 5, but, in fact, they did not. They interacted with so-called simulated participants. Basically, they were being told something, right? And then they reacted to it. So they were given 3 wines, and in fact, all 3 wines were the same, except that the third one was tainted with vinegar. So it actually was obviously worse than the first 2, and the first 2 were exactly the same. And sometimes you find these experiments. Funnily, when I was in Zurich, like a student there was doing this kind of experiment with apple juice, where people were given different kinds of apple juice, and they were, told different things, but in fact it was exactly the same apple juice. And afterwards, they had to evaluate, certain things. And by doing these kind of things, you hold one thing constant, but you change only one other thing, you can see the effect of changing that other thing. Yeah? So those guys, they gave their ratings of the wines after seeing how 4 of these fake participants had rated. Right? So imagine there's 6 people in the room, right? And now it's your turn, and it seems on your little computer screen that 4 other people already rated that wine, right? They already gave their rating, and now you're being prompted, now give your rating. Okay, Because now we're going towards this idea, they want to see actually does it lead to conformity to begin with? Now, does social pressure actually matter? Do people rate that wine differently when others had rated it already? Right? Do they follow up on that? But then, and these 4 ratings, they all claimed a huge difference between the first and the second wine. While in fact there was none. Right? And then the question is, do you now also claim there's a difference between the first and the second wine, even though there is none, but because there is social pressure, others say there's a difference, do you follow up on that? Right? Okay, so that's the first part of the experiment. That kind of leads to an answer to the question, is there conformity? How do people follow others in their judgment, basically? But then there's this other part. Remember, there are 6 people in the room. So supposedly 4 already gave the rating. Now it's your turn. And then after you see a 6th person giving a rating on your computer screen. Yeah, you see that you already gave your rating, and now you see the 6th person giving a rating, and that person is sort of like the lone rider, and that person, it's also a fake participant, but that fake participant makes a true call. Says, I don't know, there's no difference. I don't know, I can't really tell a difference. So that's basically like this idea, like there's this person who speaks the truth. Right? And you also observe that person speaking the truth, but after you already given your statement about it. Okay, it's a bit of a complex design, but we'll come back to that again. So what is the result? Well, first of all, there is evidence for conformity. So like 53% of the students rated the second wine below the identical first wine. So remember, every single person had heard 4 other people saying that there is a difference. That the second wine is worse than the first. And then 53% of the people who had heard that, they also said that there is the difference. So there was clear evidence for conformity. People followed others, even though there was no difference. But now the key comes into play in this Dutch round that follows afterwards. And this Dutch round where we don't just evaluate the wine, but afterwards we also evaluate each other. That's like this idea. And now there's one last piece in the puzzle, and then we're there, and hopefully then it makes all sense, that people kind of, in some of those groups, people made these evaluations of others in private. Basically, they wrote down, I don't know, your judgment was great, your judgment was not that great, and I don't know, somebody else really sucked. That was one case, one half of the group, but the other half of the group, again, this is sort of like the treatment that comes into play here, right? Like some people kind of evaluated others in private, where nobody saw what they thought about each other, while in other group, they evaluated each other in public. Basically, really pointing at each other in public where others see. That's the general design. Okay, so here I have a little schema of the design, just as a reminder. So people come in, undergraduate students, they drink 3 different wines. In fact, the first and the second wine, there's no difference. It's exactly the same wine. Then they rate that wine after hearing 4 other people that praise others, said there is a difference between the two, while the 6th person who came in after that participant said there's no difference, right? And then afterwards, it kind of split into 2 groups, like half of the participants, or in those different groups, they didn't just have 6 people, but lots of different groups of 6 people. And some of these groups, individuals, then rated each other's judgment in public, while in other groups, they rated each other's judgment in private. Okay, and now we're at the result, and in order to understand that, I'm tracking back a little bit, so now I'm only showing you a little piece of that result. So now we're talking about on the y-axis, we have, so on the axis going up from 1 to 4, that's basically the kind of rating that people give to others. Now 4 is like, I think this is really good. 1 was, that kind of was a sucky rating. I don't know, I didn't really like what you said. Now that's the judgment of the participants of each other. Yeah, okay. So now we are, if you look at the very bottom, we are in the private group. That means like these are now the individuals that kind of judged each other in private. Like writing on a little piece of paper, like what they thought about the others, without those others seeing it. Yeah. Okay, now we are sort of like, we have this conformed here. That conformed means that I'm a person who followed the first 4 people who said that there is a difference. Right? I'm the 5th person, and I could be either one who follows this social pressure and also says there's a difference, even though there's none. I'm a conformist then. Or I could be a deviant, meaning I say, well, there is no difference, even though everybody else said there is a difference. Yeah? So that's here what this conformed means. And now, lastly, we have like these 2 bars here. They refer to the rating that they gave to either those supposedly 4 people who kind of conformed, basically those people who said there is no difference. Conforming here means like saying there is a difference between the first and the second wine, while the deviant target is basically the lone rider, this guy at the end, after you did what you did, after you rated the wine, that person said there is no difference. So now, how do we interpret that? Is that people who, in private, evaluate others' judgment, while in fact they personally, they succumbed to social pressure, they conformed, but still they kind of rate the person who said the truth higher, right? So this white bar is higher than the gray bar. That means if you were supposedly the lone rider who kind of said there is no difference, and I said there is a difference, I still rated you higher. Because probably secretly I know there was no difference, and I don't know, I kind of value what you did, right? But now the key is that this happens in private. And then we can compare that. How do those ratings of the conformist target, a person who conformed to the social pressure, while in contrast to a deviant target who did not conform to the social pressure, how does that difference look like when I make my judgment in private or in public? And that's sort of where false enforcement is coming into play, because if it is in private, there is no enforcement happening. It's like the true what I think of others. Yeah? While when it happens in public, that I kind of judge you guys, then I kind of think about this social situation, and I might actually then punish you for saying something that is deviant from what we all said, but in fact, actually, I really know that you're right, but I still punish you. That's the situation where you're the naked emperor, and I'm kind of like saying, "Oh, you didn't really, don't you? Or you're the person who cannot see the clothes of the naked emperor, and I'm the person like, cannot you see it? Yeah, even though personally I also see that the emperor is naked." Okay, so now let me show you the full graph, and now let's focus on these 2 highlighted areas. I explained the one at the very left. These are people who conformed. Basically, they succumb to social pressure, and how they rate either the conformist or the deviant target, but they did so in private. And now you see on the other side, further to the right, how these ratings looked like in the groups where individuals judged others in public, where others could see. And what you see now is it's turned around. You see now the dark gray bar is higher than the white bar. Meaning, these are exactly the same kind of people that followed suit to social pressure, right? But as soon as you put them on the spot in public to then kind of give a rating about others who said the truth, they kind of punish them for having said the truth because they didn't conform. Right? While in private, they don't do that. While in private, they actually appreciate them. So that's essentially the finding of this paper, or the aspect that I want to focus on, this difference, how this switches from when these judgments happen privately or when they happen publicly. So students complied with the normative opinion to favor one wine over another when the 2 were identical, but when rating of others was public, students sanctioned the lone deviant. So the lone deviant is the person that says the truth, but everybody else seemed to have said something else, and now it's my turn to judge the lone deviant. If I do that in public, I sanction the guy for not having followed what everybody else did, for violating the norm. But when rating of others was private, students did not sanction the lone deviant. So if that person said the truth, I also sort of like followed social pressure, but now I kind of, nobody is going to see, there is no public component of this whole thing. Nobody is going to see whether I kind of, what I say about the lone deviant. Then actually suddenly I don't sanction the person anymore, even though there is no difference. So the storyline here is that social pressure to conform to a norm can lead to those who conform, even though they might not believe in it, to also sanction others for not conforming. And that's evidence for false enforcement. It's a bit of a tricky design, but at the end, when you think about it, it's brilliant. It's really nice. It's like has these two steps in it. It requires you thinking about it a little bit, like how did they do it? But at the end of the day, they didn't just look at social pressure that leads people to conform, but then they also kind of really nicely showed by having these judgments either in private or in public, how suddenly people judge others when it occurs publicly, meaning others see there's this enforcement component to it. People are now in this situation where they basically give others a bad rating for having said the truth, because even though they know they said the truth. But they didn't follow the social pressure to begin with. While if you would ask them privately, they wouldn't sanction them. Okay, so that's the story of false enforcement. And now I have a second experiment. I'm briefly going to touch on this. It's actually the same idea. When you have these kind of ideas and you want to write good papers, you have to show this, that it's not just a fluke, right? That it's not just, I don't know, about this particular setting. So the best possible way of doing that is repeating your experiment in different domains and then showing that the point that you're actually making is more general and not just specific to a particular domain. So in this case, again, students came into these cubicles, undergraduate students, and they were invited to a roundtable text evaluation study. Where each participant was sitting there, and they were told they would interact, again, the same story, they were told to interact with 5 other participants in the group during the experiment, but in fact, again, these were like simulated participants. And what they did have to do, they had to read a text that you guys actually are familiar with. They were told it was written by Dr. Robert Nelson, PhD. So funny, as a doctor and PhD, it's like, it's the same, yeah. And the Albert W. Newcomb Professor of Philosophy, blah, 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 and MacArthur, nothing of that is real, right? So but they were told that this is the guy who wrote the text. And which text did they have to read? Well, the beautiful Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which you by now know is beautifully written, but it's really bullshit. There's nothing in it. Yeah? It's like beautiful phrases, but it doesn't make sense at all. It's nonsense. Yeah, it's nonsense. Okay, after reading the essay, students were asked to evaluate the text on several dimensions, like how understandable is it, how persuasive is it, and so on, right? And but while in fact the text was nonsense, and participants, same story, they gave their rating of the text after they had heard what 4 other people had said about that text. Then they give their rating, right? These other 4, they praised the text highly. They said, oh, it's a beautiful text, it's fantastic, right? And then it was your turn to rate that text, which was bullshit. So we know it was bullshit. But now we kind of create a situation where we create, again, social pressure of praising a text. Do you fall into that? Do you also praise the text? And then after you gave your rating, we have, again, the lone writer, the 6th participant who says, well, this is bullshit. Who basically speaks the truth. So same design, and afterwards, again, they had like this round where they evaluate each other. Like how useful or how intelligent are your ratings and comments about that. Same setting, having that in private and in public. This is the design. They had like another step in between where had people evaluate the text in private to get the benchmark and to actually show that people understood that it is bullshit. And actually, when people evaluated the text in private, they actually gave it really low ratings. They understood that it's bullshit. But when they kind of had to evaluate the text in public, nobody wanted to admit that they didn't understand the transgressing the boundaries of quantum hermeneutics. Yeah? You won't want to admit that. Yeah? Sounds very intelligent. Sounds very sociological. Yeah? So in public, people praise the text more than if they would have just rated it in private. There's like a benchline test to actually see that there is a conformity pressure happening. And then public rating of others of the other participants or private rating of the other participants. And again, we have like a similar graph that kind of comes out of this at the end of the day. And now I want to put focus on these two things. In the first case at the left, again, we have like individuals who basically said the text is great after 4 other people said the text is great, even though it's not, right? And then they kind of rated they judged the other people in private on a piece of paper. How useful is your comment? And they judged different kinds of people, like those that conformed, those that also conformed, and those, I don't know, and the lone deviant, the guy who actually said it's nonsense. And you see, well, it's about the same. You know? There is no big difference. We cannot really say there's no statistically significant difference between these bars around it. There's a confidence interval, so that's kind of like, I don't know how it spreads. So we cannot really say that they're different. So there was no difference in kind of ratings of either others who conformed or the deviant target, the lone writer who said the truth that the text is bullshit. But now when we look at the public ratings of each other, the public judgments. Yeah. So this is now a set, remember this, the design, like half of the group had to judge each other in private and the other half had to judge each other in public. When we go to that group that judge each other in public, now we are on the right side in the highlighted area. People who kind of had to judge each other in public, they also conformed to it. Yeah? So they followed suit and said, okay, this is like a great text, even though it wasn't. And now what you see is now they give other people who also conform to it a higher rating than the lone deviant. Now they sanction the lone deviant for saying the truth, but for not following the norm, which is we all praise the text. So again, this is sort of like a second study that shows through this tool of public versus private, like how false enforcement can occur, or that it occurs. That people enforce something that they don't really believe in themselves. Now, it's actually not easy to show that. It's like, whoa, a little bit, through your knee and back and up again. How can we show that people enforce something that they don't really believe in themselves? But with this design, they did in these 2 studies. So students evaluated the text higher when they evaluated it publicly after the 4 fake appraisals compared to when they evaluated it without the fake appraisals. And they realized that the text was nonsense, but didn't say so in public. Students rated the 6th fake participant who said the paper was nonsense down when they rated each other in public. So that lone writer gets punished. Okay, what's the storyline of that? That's what Willer and others say, that group members who already have conformed to a norm will also enforce it to signal to other group members their sincerity of their conformity. It's easy to just follow along. It's easy to just go along and also do lots of drinking because you think others think that this is what you need to do as an undergraduate student, unless you're in a reading week and you really catch up on the readings. Yeah? In fact, this is what you want to do. You want to do the readings, actually it's cool readings, but you feel the pressure to party all the time because you think this is what your students or your friends want you to do. Yeah? So you could go along with that, but it would make you look a little desperate. Like you are sort of like this person who gets pressured into things. So in order to show your sincerity about that, that's what Willer and others say. Like one strategy is to enforce that norm, to make others feel bad for not going out drinking all day, all week during the reading. Okay, so when we summarize that whole idea about false enforcement, we should not necessarily assume that enforcers believe the views they pressure others to adopt. It's an interesting one, that people might not just not do what they don't want, but actually they might also enforce something that they don't really want by themselves. I could argue, okay, well, shouldn't that lead to an instability of the whole thing? Or how can it be that these kind of norms prevail? Shouldn't at some point somebody realize that all we want to do is do the readings? They actually are cool. So let's spend the time on that during the readings. Shouldn't somebody at some point point the finger at the emperor and say, man, you're naked? And now this is where this paper comes in, paper by Centola, and there's also Rob Willer and Michael Macy in it. Interestingly, they wrote this paper first and the other one later, even though the logic is a bit the other way around. But in this paper, in The Emperor's Dilemma, also published in the AJS, American Journal of Sociology, one of our 2 best journals, right? So if I want to become a full professor one day, I have to publish in one of these 2 journals, or at least at a good university, this is what you have to do. And in that paper, they basically asked the question, can this mechanism of false enforcement, can that explain the problem or this puzzle that we had at first, that there are these unpopular norms and that they seem to be stable? Can false enforcement make unpopular norms stable? And they use an agent-based simulation for that. What is an agent-based simulation? Basically, it's like a computer program where you simulate little individuals. It's like Sims. If you ever played Sims, that's sort of like how an agent-based simulation is. You give your agents certain attributes and characteristics, and then you have them interact with each other, right? And then you see what comes out of it. And sometimes it's fascinating that there are very complex patterns coming out of that, out of very simple rules. Right? So complexity doesn't mean complex doesn't mean complicated. In fact, it's the opposite. Oftentimes, complex things are the outcome of very simple sets of rules. But they are often counterintuitive. So they kind of, built this model. It's like an idea where agents have a certain, belief, a certain compliance, a certain enforcement. Do they enforce? Do they believe in it? And so on. Or do they actually follow the norm? And then they have them interact with each other. Oftentimes these papers are very, very stylistic, so very abstract, right? So, but that's not the point of those papers, to show one-to-one what happens in reality. It's actually often the point of those papers to see, okay, there's this mechanism operating in these very stylized conditions. Okay, and basically, those who admire the emperor are desirous. Okay, that's this idea of false enforcement. So actually, they built that in this model, and actually they show that false enforcement can make unpopular norms extremely stable. A small number of true believers can actually suffice to generate norms that most of the people do not really want. And immediately you can think of something like the prohibition in the United States, that a couple of small amount of people wanted. Highly religious groups, they said, I don't know, it's the devil. Yeah? But it's a small fraction of the overall population, but still it led to a norm that not only people followed, right, and Congress voted for, but then actually people also enforced and punished others for drinking alcohol, even though they personally would have loved to have the odd pint here and there. I'm not going to get into the details of the model. If you're interested in these kind of agent-based models, kind of cool stuff. Maybe it's more a little for the master students here. Basically, these agents get three properties. They get a belief, a compliance, and a strength of conviction. We can represent these kind of things mathematically. You have like a belief of 1 if you really believe in it, or a belief of -1 if you don't believe in it. Yeah? If you truly don't believe in it, and so on. Then you have compliance. It means like 1, that you comply with the norm, and 0, you disobey the norm. And then you have a value that ranges from 0 to 1, which is just how strong is your conviction. Like how much do you really care about this at the end of the day. That's sort of like the starting conditions of these properties. And then you could, model in this computer program, in this simulation, which is very dynamic, you model 2 decisions. First one is, should an agent comply to the norms? Basically, an agent is always like thinking in this particular situation at a particular moment in time, should I now comply to the norm? And there's a simple rule about that. I comply to the norm based on my own belief, based on the strength of the conviction, and based on the pressure that I get from others. Right? So if sort of like the pressure from others exceeds at some point my own belief, and the conviction that I have, or the strength of that into that belief, then at some point I falter. Some people falter earlier, and they comply to the norm. Others who actually really strongly believe in one thing, maybe they never fall, right? Regardless of the pressure that they get. Essentially, this is a function that people kind of make a decision to comply to a norm. It's a function of their own belief, the strength of the conviction, and the pressure that they receive from others. I already see where the simulation comes into play, because then that individual might comply to the norm, but then also, that signals something to other people. Then my neighbor suddenly sees that I'm complying to the norm, and then the neighbor thinks that, whoa, there are lots of pressure here. Lots of people comply to the norm, even though I didn't really believe in it. But the neighbor doesn't know that. The neighbor just sees me doing something or complying to the norm. Okay, so that's the first decision that is being modeled in this paper, and then the second one in an agent-based model is, should the agent then enforce the norm? Again, it's like a function of own belief, strength of conviction, some pressure from others, and then also some costs. Like, I don't know, because enforcing something, I could as well just walk away and don't care. Right? enforcing, I don't know, telling you not to do that, kind of, there's some costs associated to that. I have to do it. I don't know, if I would force people to not drink alcohol even though I believe in it, I don't know. I don't know. My social standing would go down probably. Yeah. Okay, so these kind of things, and I don't want to get into detail. You can read up the paper, but it's actually, don't be afraid from these kind of papers. It's very straightforward. It's a little mathematical, but it's a little abstract, where we simply have like a compliance of an individual I is either my belief, that's B, or it's the opposite of my belief, which is minus B, if the pressure that I get is above a certain strength of my conviction. That's what it says. S is my strength of conviction, and E is sort of like, I don't know how many other people enforce and how many other people believe in it. That's sort of like the social pressure that I get. Right? Okay, but I don't want to get further into that. The second component, they also model it in a similar way. Like, should I enforce a certain norm? And again, they model it, like E is now like I enforce, it's 0 or 1. 1 meaning I enforce, and 0 meaning I don't enforce. And there they say, okay, it's either my belief, I believe in something, then it's like B plus, if, again, certain costs, I believe in it, I think it's important, and so on. It's the opposite, I enforce it when I have a certain amount of social pressure on me that exceeds a certain costs. That's what you see in the first line. Or, I don't know, I don't really care, I don't do nothing. And with these two decisions, then you can actually simulate what actually happens at time point. And these simulations are pretty cool because you see how things unfold over time. So you will see more examples of that after the break. There I'll show you actually some agent-based simulations on segregation. They're very straightforward, where you actually see how a world unfolds and how suddenly something happens and how certain patterns evolve from these very simple rules. And here in that paper, they show how at the end of the day, we can end up in a scenario where people who didn't really believe in it in the first instance, they enforce the norms, while actually the people who do believe in it, they don't enforce it anymore. Because they have nothing to prove. And then they show different interesting results, like how when these kind of cascades occur, when they don't, I don't know, I don't want to talk too much about it, but it's often like counterintuitive results about these things. For example, that if you have a smaller number of true believers, it can lead to bigger cascades of compliance and enforcement at the end of the day than if you would have had a lot of true believers in the first instance. Why is that? Well, because if you have a lot of true believers in it, they don't have to prove themselves. But if you have only a few true believers, they are enough to kind of get the whole thing started, and then the other people that don't really believe in it, they need to prove themselves, they need to show their sincerity to it, and then they start enforcing. So you can have these very counterintuitive results, and that's actually the coolest papers where something kind of comes about that you did not really think about. Okay, let's not talk about that, because I want to move on to the last piece. Okay, so we talked about unpopular norms, we talked about false enforcement and so on, people enforcing norms. Let's talk a little bit about who are those people that enforce norms. Who enforces norms on whom? And now one question, that was the reading for today, does ethnicity matter in that regard? And here I want to talk about a recent, very cool paper of two folks that I actually know as well. Actually, I think they do cool research, and one of my PhD students, she does very similar research about this right now. So maybe I'm going to mention her stuff briefly as well. So in this paper, they conducted an experiment on social norm enforcement in a real setting, in the real world. What did they do? Well, actually they had an actor, a Confederate, sitting next to the entrance of the metro in Cologne. And that actor threw away a coffee cup on the floor, even though there was a trash bin just 2 meters away. And now what they did, they kind of looked at how many people who basically just walked by, they always identified one person that they would focus on. That person walked by. Does that person come to this Confederate where they don't really know that it actually is a study, and says, well, can you please pick up that coffee mug and throw it in the bin? It's just over there. Basically, this is the setting. Now you see there's an entry to the metro, and there's this guy standing there, and this guy is actually an actor. But people don't know that. That's an actor, he has a coffee cup in his hand, right? And there's the trash bin just next to it, and now people walk towards that They walk towards that entry, they want to go down, and at that moment, that actor just drops the cup. Yeah? Like very obviously violating the norm that we shouldn't throw stuff on the floor, we shouldn't litter, especially when there's a rubbish bin just next to it. Yeah? So the people they focus on were the people that walk by. It's like a field experiment where people didn't really know that they are part of an experiment. And these are the kind of cool experiments, that, I don't know, in the ideal world, I would love you to come up with ideas like that for the assignment, or maybe also for, I don't know, for thesis projects and so on, because I think they are really cool. And so they kind of look at how do people react in real life on that. Do they kind of approach the person who dropped the cup and say, man, pick up that cup? Yeah. Or do they not do that? Okay, now what was the treatment? Again, you see like these kind of designs, like Confederate throws a coffee cup on the floor, even though there is a trash bin just next to it. But then kind of in some of the cases, the Confederate was a native. He looked like a native, like a person, actually in this case, I put in a little native. And in that case, actually I'll show you in a second what it was. The whole thing happened in Germany, so it looked like a person who's actually German. Yeah. While in other cases, the Confederate person who dropped that coffee mug looked like he or she is from an ethnic minority. And at the end, they simply counted how many times do people approach the Confederate and sanction that person for violating the norm. It's like how many times do they enforce the norm. So the only difference is that the Confederate looks different. In the one case looks like the native, in the other case it's the ethnic minority group. And now these are the actors that they used. Yeah? Like the top row, apparently they look German, I don't know. And the bottom row, apparently they look from an ethnic minority. And the result is actually very striking. You can already see it at the very end, that the actors that were from the ethnic minority, they were sanctioned much more. So if you were foreign looking and you threw a cup on the floor, people would approach you much more often and tell you, don't do that. While if you would look German and you would throw that on the floor, people wouldn't come to you and say, don't do that. Maybe they were afraid, I don't know, I would be afraid of the Germans. Yeah. Well, here's the summary of the results. Yeah? So now they have like 4 categories, because we have like native actors and minority actors. But what they also did, they also identified the person, right? Is that person kind of approaching that entrance? Is that person native or foreign? And you could question that, but they actually argue for their case. Actually they distinguish through visual clues, through skin color, mostly, like who is like native and who is from the minority group. And what you see here is actually pretty stunning. That if you happen to be from an ethnic minority, people sanction you more for violating a norm. While if you happen to be a native, people don't sanction you that much. And here you also see another difference, is that actually natives tend to sanction more. Right? So you are more likely to get sanctioned by somebody who is native than from somebody who is from an ethnic minority. While in surveys before, they had exposed people to similar situations where they were given a picture and they were being told to how would you decide in this situation and so on. There was no difference across those groups. But in reality, when they conducted that field experiment, there were these clear differences. So basically, natives who walk by are more likely to enforce the norm than minority members, ethnic minority members. And there is discrimination against minority Confederates who violate the norm, in contrast to native Confederates who violate the norm. And we're running out of time, but I want to tell the story. Like my PhD student, one of my PhD students at the moment, as part of her PhD, they did a really cool experiment. Like in Zurich, they have like these escalators at the train station, and there's the norm. I don't know, stand right, walk left, or walk. I don't know. You know the norm. I don't know how it goes. Yeah, stand on the right, walk on the left. You know it from the London Tube as well. They have these big signs and so on, right? And what they did, they also had, like in this case, we were actually students that kind of blocked the whole escalator, right? So kind of blocked it like in a row that nobody could pass by. And then they also looked at how many times do others sanction that person? How many times do others lash out to that poor student for violating that norm? Right? The whole thing was planned, but now the treatment comes into play. So the treatment was, and there it becomes fascinating, the treatment was that in some cases, the students were female students, they were wearing a headscarf. While in other cases, they were not. And the result is pretty straightforward, that in the case where the students were the head staff and blocked the escalator, people lashed out much more than when it was a student without a headscarf. So you see, not only is there enforcement happening, but the identity of the individuals matters in here as well. But I want to leave it like that. And you have the reading week, do the assignments. Also don't forget the reading for the next lecture, which is on the 6th of November. It's Gladwell. It should be a fun reading. It's an easy reading. And if you feel like it, I don't know, have a look at the books that I recommend. Yeah, see you after the break.
So